Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name is Bryan Hughes. You can find me everywhere online at Nebrius, Twitter, GitHub, things like that. And yeah, I work at Microsoft. So today I'm going to be talking about anxiety and queerness and kind of how that manifests in myself and this little app that I built to help me with it. First up, if that's going to work, there we go, content warnings. I am going to be talking, of course, about mental illness. I'm going to be talking about homophobia, growing up queer in the South, so it's going to be an intense talk. But yeah, so anxiety brain. All right, I am giving up on that thing. So yeah, I deal with a lot of anxiety. It's something I've dealt with for a long time, although it took me a while to realize it for a lot of reasons. But it's something where my anxiety is kind of middle of the road, I would say. I definitely know people who deal with anxiety that's a lot less than me, but also people who deal with it and it's a lot more than me. It's enough that I am in therapy. It's something I have to manage. And it manifests in a lot of different ways. Like mental illness, for most people, it's always a little bit different. And so for me, one of the big things, the way that anxiety manifests is that I'm really bad about keeping in touch with people. I'm really good about being present in the moment, talking to you. I think I talked with a bunch of you last night. And I'm great at that, but when it comes time to reach out over text or DM, email, whatever, just really working on that relationship, I'm bad at it. And it comes from social anxiety, ultimately, and a few other things. So I decided that this was an area where tech can help. Because the thing about mental illness is we're constantly managing it. It's not something that you take a pill and it's fixed. It's something that we have to work on. And sometimes we need tools to help us with it. And so I wrote this tool to help me with this one very specific aspect of my anxiety. So I call it Contact Scheduler. I'm not particularly good at naming things, so it's pretty functional, but it works. It's open source, online, GPL license. You can check it out. So I created this. I had a couple of design goals in mind to make sure that it worked really well. The first is that it needed to be as automated as possible. Anytime I have to go in and do a thing, that's a chance that I won't do that thing. And I found I tried in the past using just a normal calendar to add an entry to hey, reach out to this person. Never worked. Largely because I forgot to just add stuff to it. There was a human error element of it, so I needed to remove as much of that as possible. And the next one is that it needs to be schedule aware. If I ever get a notification saying, hey, do this thing, and I'm in the middle of a meeting, that makes my anxiety worse, not better. So it needs to be able to figure out when is actually a good time to tell me about it. And then finally, it needs to be low stakes. The thing about anxiety is it ratchets up pressure, and then whenever something else is pressuring, it gets worse, and it gets into a bit of this cycle. So it needs to be really low stakes. And so when I designed it, it looks kind of like this. There are 3 tabs to it. There's sort of a home tab, this contacts tab, and a calendar tab. So on the contacts tab, I add in all the people I want to keep in touch with, using Futurama characters here, because I like to use them as placeholders. And you notice this is a very simple UI. There's very, very little to it, and that is actually by design. This is still kind of beta, so it's missing some features, but this page is complete. So in this page, which I see is not on the monitor right now, you got a list of names, and you add just a name and how frequently you want to reach out to them. Very simple, and that's by design. It does the rest for me. And so then on the home page, each week it's going to create a queue of people for me to reach out to, and it'll just sort of intersperse that throughout the week. And it does it using a variety of pieces of information, how often I want to reach out to someone, when I last reached out to them, and a few other heuristics going into it. And so when it's time to reach out to someone, it gives me a notification that looks like this. Now, if you start looking at this is actually kind of different than a typical notification, even though it may not be quite obvious. The biggest thing is compared to a calendar, there is no snooze or dismiss by design. So what I learned with a calendar is the way it interacts with my anxiety, and I think a lot of people's anxiety, is we get a notification, especially a calendar notification, and there's this feeling that we have to do it right then. It's you must do this thing at this moment. I'm going to keep bothering you until you do. And that really spikes anxiety, as it turns out. That is a UI pattern that is bad for anxiety. And now, if you have a meeting you have to get to at a time, that's just the nature of it. But reaching out to someone, it doesn't matter if I do it now versus a half hour from now. It just matters that I reach out to that person. So I changed this so that there is no snooze and dismiss, and it's kind of an asynchronous UI pattern. This pops up for 15 seconds and then goes away on its own. So it's like an auto snooze, and that's intentionally a very short period of time so that I actually can't respond to it in that period of time. The idea is it pops up, it gets the idea in my head like, oh yeah, I need to reach out to this person, and goes away. And then just eventually, I'll get around to it, when I have a few minutes. But it's there in my brain already. It's kind of taking up space, and I'll remember to do it. And so whenever I do reach out to them, I actually have to wait for this to pop up again, and then that's when I hit respond. And then it'll move on to the next person. Sometimes there can be anxiety around reaching out to a specific person. Maybe I have to have a really difficult conversation with them, or it's been a long time since I reached out to them and I'm feeling anxious about the fact that I haven't reached out to them. So sometimes just saying like, okay, I'm not gonna do this person right now, I'll reach out to someone else first, that can kind of help to just like ease the anxiety and give me a little more prep to do it again. So that's how that works. Remixing this notification pattern has helped a lot. And like this is still beta stage. Like, this is not a particularly good mechanism, actually. It can be a lot better. But it's already better than what we have. And I don't say this because like I have some insight. I'm actually a pretty bad UI UX designer. It's just that I don't think anyone's ever tried to create a UI that works with people's anxiety. And in the little bit I've been using this so far, it has made a difference. So I think there's something to it. And so I implemented this using Electron.js, TypeScript, because I love TypeScript, go figure, working for Microsoft. I used SQLite to store all the data in it. That way it's on a file on your laptop, and you have control over that. This is ultimately mapping relationships, so that is really important private information. And so I didn't want to deal with the privacy issues of going into the cloud. And then finally, I'm not there yet, but I will be using the Microsoft Graph API to connect to my calendars and figuring out proper times. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that, like, wait, did Bryan just finish talking about his app in a 35-minute talk in the first 10 minutes or so? Yes, that is exactly what I did. But the reason for that is mental health doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there's always more to the story. My mental health, anxiety isn't this thing that exists in a crystalline form under a glass jar somewhere. It is intertwined with everything else in my life. And so to understand my anxiety, you kind of have to understand where I came from. And that truth is, I am a bisexual, polyamorous atheist who was born and raised in various parts of Texas and New Mexico, not called Austin. And so I was born in Houston, Texas, in 1982. Now that actually means that I'm older than I look. I'm older than you probably think I am. I'm technically a Gen Xer, according to pretty much every definition. And that actually matters, as it turns out. So I was born in Houston, lived there for 3 years, moved to a place in New Mexico, called Truth or Consequences, that one little star kind of in the New Mexico side, and lived there for 4 years. So then I moved to Denton, Texas, which is in the north part of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And I spent all of my adolescence there, all the way through high school. And then I went to college in Lubbock, Texas. Now, Texas in general is a strange place, suffice to say. And Denton is a strange place inside of a strange state, as is Lubbock. So Texas, the thing it's known for, well, one of the things it's known for is that there's a university there called the University of North Texas. Turns out they have the #2 jazz program in the nation. Who knew? Now, actually, my family did. That's why we moved. My dad wanted to go back to school. But outside of Texas, it's on the very northern part of the Metroplex, so it's surrounded by farmland. And this town had this very tiny artistic core, and then a bunch of that was liberal, and a lot of really conservative folks right around it. We were kind of all mixed together. Then Lubbock, though, was sort of the opposite of that. Lubbock, when I lived there, was rated as the second most conservative city in the nation, with a population over 100,000, I think. So that is more what you would expect. So I'm giving you this idea in your head. I grew up in Texas, queer person from there. You might be thinking you know what that's like, but you're probably wrong, actually. Yes, these places are incredibly conservative, but it doesn't manifest the way most liberal folks think. And this is a struggle that I have trying to describe it all the time. So most people think that homophobia, racism, things like that in the South looks like KKK members burning crosses, or the Westboro Baptist Church picketing funerals with signs saying that people like me are going to hell. That exists, but it's a very, very tiny proportion. There's only 5,000 KKK members in the entire United States. And that's a super tiny fraction of the South. Because the thing is, most bigotry in the South doesn't look like overt violence. It's a lot more subtle and a lot more pervasive. The South is, I think, more racist and homophobic and everything else than you think it is, but not in the way you think it is at all. And unfortunately, like the thing that I see about this all the time is there's this straw man construction created of the South. And what I always see, especially white liberal folks doing with this, is they say, like, this is what bigotry looks like. This is what racism looks like. So I'm not racist because I'm nothing like this thing I just made up. And that's actually how this conversation goes down. Because I've also lived I live in San Francisco now, and I lived there for almost a decade. So I know San Francisco as well. And the truth is, San Francisco is racist as fuck. Seriously, like, look at the history of it, or look at the current numbers on it. San Francisco, the population of San Francisco is only 3% African American. That is the lowest of any major city in the entire United States, by far. Like, San Francisco managed to somehow beat out Phoenix, Arizona for having fewer African American folks. Arizona. And this is not an accident either. If you look at the history of it, San Francisco actively chased out African Americans. And we see this going on today. And the thing is that like bigotry in the South doesn't look that different than bigotry on the West Coast. And for me, what that meant growing up though is like, so Texas is a weird thing. It's not quite the South. It's like the South's sibling, or younger sibling in a way. And it gets a lot of its culture from the South, but it also gets some culture from the Midwest. And so what this means in culture, especially when I was growing up, is that you just didn't talk about anything controversial. That was like a major social faux pas. It was out of turn. You just didn't do it. The thing is, though, when I was growing up, queerness was controversial, so you didn't talk about it, ever. And like it's especially complicated for me because I'm bisexual, I'm not gay. And there is a bit of a difference. And growing up, I knew that I was interested in women. ... But like, yeah, growing up, especially when I was young, like I grew up without internet. The internet didn't come around until I was in middle school. And even then, back then, it was not like we had today. There wasn't a way for me to find community online. There wasn't a way for me to research even what queerness was. Like that just didn't exist. And there wasn't representation in media either. Like Will and Grace wouldn't come on until I was in high school. Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, its original name, wouldn't come on until I was in college. Like I had no role models in media. I didn't even know what bisexuality was until like my junior year in high school. And I am bi. Like I didn't know what I was. And it's not like people not talking about this was like, oh, it's just not a big deal, we're not gonna talk about it. No, this was the elephant in the room that everyone knew was there, and you could feel it. Like I could feel the presence of it growing up. But I didn't know what it was. I just knew there was something, and I knew that something involved me, and not just because of how I felt, but because of how others felt. Like I knew I was somehow other growing up. And not just in that like teenage angsty, no one understands me way, like we all go through that. That's not what I'm talking about. This is something where I knew others were treating me like. And like that sunk in. The thing about growing up queer is like, I mean, everyone's story is different and it depends a lot on the culture we grow up in, but pretty much all of us deal with homophobia growing up and we internalize it. Because when we're young, when we're kids, before we hit puberty, very, very few of us actually know that we're queer. Like that's something that usually we have to get to puberty to find out. Not always, but usually. And so what happens growing up, when we grow up in these environments, we grow up in a place where homophobia is the norm, and we learn that first. We learn that there's something wrong with being queer, and later we find out that we are queer. And we can't just turn that switch off, so we internalize it. That's what we mean when we say internalize homophobia, or internalize racism, or anything else, is that we learn what the culture wants before we learn what we are. And then we have to reconcile that somehow. In a lot of places where homophobia looks like violence, which is a lot of places, that gets internalized as hatred and self-loathing. But like that wasn't exactly what I dealt with growing up. And for a long time, I actually thought that I just somehow like dodged a bullet with this, that somehow I was like a lucky one, because I don't have that kind of internalized homophobia. But it is there. And this is something I've learned recently, is that for me, internalized homophobia doesn't look like violence and hate, it looks like self-denial and gaslighting. Because that's what happened when I was a kid. The oppression of knowledge was so thorough that I didn't even know there was something for me to find out about myself. I knew there was something, but I didn't know what, and I didn't have the tools to find it out and no one to show me the way. So that part of me just got cut off and put in a box. Because I knew I was attracted to women. I did kind of figure out eventually that like being gay was a thing. Once again, I knew I wasn't gay. And at the time, that was the only thing that got in about queerness at all, at least in men. And so I knew I wasn't gay, but I knew there was something else, so I just thought maybe I was broken, like there was a crossed wire or something in my brain. And like that got internalized, that just, oh, there's this weird thing going on, but like the culture, we don't talk about it, so I'm just gonna shove it aside and not think about it, and I did that to myself. Like this is by erasure, pure and simple. And I erased myself. And I'm not the only one. This is a very common story among bi folks, very common. And so I knew I had to get out of Texas, though, especially once I got into college. I kind of started figuring some of this out. Like, I didn't know this in high school. I mean, I knew there was something. I knew the way other people treated me. I knew when Matthew Shepard was tortured and murdered for being gay, that struck at a core of me that I didn't understand, but I knew I was afraid. Like, that was high school for me. And then college wasn't much better. I started figuring this out just because I'm getting older, but now I was in a much, much more conservative place. The kind of place where it's not just everyone is Christian, that's just the way it is in Texas. But this place, it was like at least half of the city was young earth creationist evangelical style of Christianity. And so like living in that, even more oppressed. And I had to cut that side off from me in order to keep myself safe. And I know now that what I did was I put myself in the closet without even knowing that closet was there. And I stayed in it for decades. I'm in my late 30s now, or getting there. And so I'm starting to really work on this. And like I said, I've been in San Francisco for a decade. And so you might think, okay, I moved to San Francisco, which is a great place for queer folks. It really is. And you would think that that would just fix it, but it didn't. It's not just about getting physically away from where you're at, but you have to get away from it mentally too. And I'm still stuck there in a lot of ways. And of course, like I said, San Francisco is not perfect, far from it. Like what I have learned, I do have a lot of straight friends. Historically, the majority of my friends have been straight. And in San Francisco, I learned that it's a very accepting, welcoming place for queer folks, but kind of as long as you stay in line. There's certain ways that they expect us to express our queerness. But as soon as we start calling out bullshit on the part of our straight friends there in San Francisco, all of a sudden then we become the divisive ones. We're the ones causing trouble. Why don't we just all get along? And this isn't just queer folks. This happens to you, by the way. This is people of color, the disabled. This is the same story being told over and over again, even in liberal areas. And even in activist circles. So I'm something of an activist. If you follow me online, you might have seen some of the things I've done. I was involved in the Node.js project for a long time, trying to change things there. And I've done a few other things more recently. And activism is a weird, weird thing. It's like, we tend to think of activism as like, oh, I'm going to go protest this thing. I'm going to go hold a sign and chant. And that is a part of it. That's an important part of activism, but it's just one piece. A lot of the other work we have to do is more diplomacy and politics. And that's what I did. That's the style I did. And what I didn't know going in was when you do that, you're not calling out someone on the other side of a line who you don't know. They're faceless and nameless. You're calling out your colleagues. You're calling out your friends. And that, in some ways, it absolutely made my anxiety worse. My anxiety comes from growing up. It comes from not being able to trust people. It comes from keeping people at a distance because that's how I stay safe. And I still struggle to trust people. And I still struggle to open up a lot. I'm an incredibly difficult person to get to know. I really am. And it's not a great thing for me. I know that. And activism in some ways has made this worse. Because I had to work with colleagues and friends, people that were causing problems saying, hey, you're being an asshole, but also people who I saw being hurt. And one of the hardest things I've ever had to do was in the Node project. I remember this vividly, having to tell people that I care a lot about who are being hurt that I can't do anything for you right now. Because if I do, it'll make things worse and we're gonna lose whatever chance we had. And the thing that made that even harder was a few months later when I thought we had our chance, tried it, and we failed anyways. It only proved me right to tell these people that I can't help you. And that is fucking hard. still. And it has pulled me away from people even more. And so yeah, I'm anxious all the time because I have to deal with this kind of shit. It never stops. Like most of the time, it's just a low hum in the background. Something that just kind of keeps me on edge, keeps me being perhaps a bit too much of a perfectionist, but it still works well. Or it works, I can deal with it easily enough. It's not a big deal, most of the time. And then there's those other times where my anxiety gets bad enough that I can't work. Like, I can't really maintain relationships. Thank God I can work from home, which, by the way, pro tip for anyone who has control over this, if you want to help people with mental health, allow them to work from home. Because if you could be on the fly on the wall on my really, really bad anxieties, you see me pacing my apartment. I cannot sit still. I cannot focus. And being at home does help, though, because at least it's in a calm, comfortable place. But it's always there, even when it's not that. And thankfully, that's rare, just, half a dozen times a year, maybe a dozen times a year. Like, it's not that common, or at least it doesn't feel that way to me. But it happens. The reverse is even rarer, though. On occasion, my anxiety actually will completely go away. It's usually fleeting just for a few minutes. But I really love those moments because, for this brief moment, I can see the kind of person I would be otherwise. I can see who I would be without anxiety. And that version of me is a much better person. I wish I could be that person all the time, but I can't. I was never given that choice. Growing up, my defense mechanisms were honed to a fine point. I had to. And this is the truth that a lot of queer people grow up, especially when we grow up alone without support, is it hardens us. We don't have a choice in this either. And we don't know how to do it in ways that are healthy either, because we have to learn it on our own. We don't have people who actually understand this. We don't have therapists to talk to, especially in conservative places. Today, in a lot of conservative places, therapists still treat queerness as a mental illness. And for a long time, it was officially classified as a mental illness. But that just makes things worse. It's not true, obviously, and it's harmful, it's hurtful. And so, I'm left dealing with this. In a lot of ways, it feels like a part of my life was stolen from me, honestly. I am who I am because of things outside my control that I never had control over. And the fact that it was so subtle growing up, it was never explicitly mentioned, I didn't know. There's always this thing, conservatives like to say, queer people, oh, you're just confused. Well, you know what, you're goddamn fucking right, I was confused because you made me confused. You never allowed me to gain clarity. And that is harmful. Being stuck in a closet you don't even know is there, but you know the feeling of it, you know that shame coming in from it, that lasts, that sticks. And I think I'm gonna be this way the rest of my life, I really do. I'm getting better, like I said, I've been in therapy, and it does make a difference. It really does help. If you are struggling, get into therapy, please. It really does help. I know it's scary. I was terrified whenever I first got in, but it really does help and make a difference. We got to remember this, and we got to remember this in our cultures and our companies, that there are a lot of people struggling with mental illness, and that comes from a lot of places that's always intertwined with something else. For me, whenever my anxiety spikes, it's not like a random thing that's unpredictable. There's always something that spikes it. And a lot of times it actually comes back to queerness in some way or fashion. Not always, queerness or activism at the very least, I should say. And it's hard. And it's especially hard knowing that this isn't something that's just in the past and done with. This is still going on. I remember I met this one guy at a conference in a much more conservative place a while ago. And he was from there. He had just moved to San Francisco a couple months prior. He moved to the Castro. And he talked about how excited he was to be there and how awesome it was. And I saw myself in him. I knew exactly where he was coming from and what he was thinking. And when he said that he was excited to be there, what he really meant was that he finally felt safe and free to be himself. But I know it's not quite that simple. I know you can't just flick a switch on that and it's all better. And I had the responsibility to tell him all of this, I think, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that, like, you're not out of the woods, that San Francisco isn't perfect, that this is gonna haunt you. I couldn't do that to him at that moment, but it sticks with me. I don't have an ending for this talk, by the way. And not because I didn't get around to it. Like, I do a lot of public speaking. I know how to formulate a talk. I know how to do a plot structure. I know how to bring it in. I don't have a talk for this. I don't have an ending for this talk because I don't have an ending to my story. A lot of times when I do culture talks, I end up with a call to action. I'm like, if you can all do one thing, do this one thing, it'll make things better. There's no call to action for this. Like, the damage has been done. I'm gonna be dealing with this for the rest of my life. And queer people today, even younger than me, are still gonna be dealing with this for the rest of our lives. There is no amount of apology, there is no amount of reparations that can undo the damage done in the past. And this is not just for queer folks, this is for people of color, this is for disabled folks, for anyone else on the outsides of society. There is no call to action for this. We have to do better, but it can never be fixed, especially while the damage is still being done today. But one thing I will say, though, is to anyone in the room who is queer or listening online for the recording of this, especially if you're still in the closet, find your community. You don't have to do it alone. Don't stay in the closet alone like I did, because that is the loneliest place in the world. Find your community, find that support so that hopefully it can blunt the damage. But it's already done for me, so I just have to keep dealing going forward and building tiny little JavaScript apps to help me with the details. Thank you.